Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California at the historic Blinn House here in Pasadena. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director for the Book Club of California. It's my pleasure to welcome you all and get this presentation started. For those of you that are new to the Book Club, we are a nonprofit member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes we do that with a focus on the history and literature of California and the West. The Book Club publishes limited edition books, and we host a year-round series of programs and exhibitions like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much, much more. And if you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, and the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you to go online to bccbooks.org to find out more about the book club. Now, in addition to supporting fine printing and the book arts, the book club has, since its very founding, been an important advocate for scholarship in and the appreciation for the history of California and the West. And that aspect of our mission remains very much part of who we are today. And tonight, the Book Club of California presents our 6th Kenneth Carmiole Endowed Lecture on the history of the book trade in California and the West. Now, we will have time for some discussion at the end of the lecture, so I ask that you hold your questions to the very end. We will come back up and do a little Q&A with the audience. And now I want to introduce the president of the Book Club's Board of Directors, Paul Robertson. He will acknowledge the generous benefactor for this important lecture series, and he'll introduce our speaker. Paul?
Thank you, Kevin. Good evening, members and guests. I am Paul Robertson, the president of the Book Club of California. On behalf of the board and our members, it is my very great pleasure to welcome you to the 6th Kenneth Carmiole Endowed Lecture on the history of the book trade in California and the West. Can you hear? Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. This perpetual lecture series has been made possible through the extraordinary generosity of longtime book club member and former Book Club of California director, Mr. Kenneth Carmiole. Ken is not only a respected member of the antiquarian bookselling community, having been the founder and president of Kenneth Carmiole Booksellers since 1975, but he has also been one of California's most active and generous supporters of academic libraries and of the bibliographic community. Ken has established multiple endowments for the purchase of rare books, research, lectures, archival studies, and the students at Rare Book School at the University of Virginia. His alma mater, UC Santa Barbara and UCLA. Ken has served 3 terms on the National Board of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America and received the Distinguished Alumni Award for 2011 from UCLA Library and Information Studies Alumni Association. The Book Club of California, future scholars, and bibliophiles everywhere benefit from his generosity in establishing this perpetual lecture series. Please join me in thanking Ken for his extraordinary support. The Book Club, let me see. Okay, and now it is my very great pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished guest lecturer, who will speak to us about the Caxton Printers of Idaho and their century of publishing in the American West. Our speaker, Alessandro Meregaglia. Alex is an archivist and associate professor at Boise State University in Idaho. where he has worked since 2016. He holds degrees from Hillsdale College and Indiana University, where he specialized in archives and records management, as well as focusing on 20th century American history. He teaches library and archival research methods to undergraduates and graduate students, and coordinates K through 12 school visits to the Boise State Library for National History Day research. Within special collections and archives, he organizes and preserves archival collections, oversees digitization projects, and manages the work of student employees and research assistants. His primary research project examines the history of Caxton Printers, a small yet prolific Idaho publishing company known for their fierce defense of freedom of expression and for being one of the most prominent publishers of conservative and libertarian books in the 20th century. Tonight, Alex will tell us about James H. Gipson, the founder of Caxton Printers, a small print shop in rural Idaho, and how Caxton grew to publish hundreds of books across all I practiced this too, all genres, primarily about the American West. He will share how this tiny publisher survived and competed with larger firms and made an impact on the history of the American West and California. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Alessandro Meregaglia.
Good evening, everyone. And thank you very much for coming this evening. I'm excited to speak with you all. Paul, thank you for that introduction, and Ken, thank you for sponsoring this lecture series. I'm excited to talk with you all tonight. Some 70 years ago, an Idaho writer quipped that of all the states in the nation, Idaho is almost the last in which one would expect to find a publishing house, let alone a successful one. And yet, in the rural American West, there is a successful publishing house, one that has been around for over 100 years and has set the standard for regional publishing. That company is Caxton Printers, founded in 1907 in Idaho. Over the last century, Caxton has published hundreds of books in numerous genres: Americana, fiction, poetry, children's stories, history, economics, among others, with subjects primarily about the western United States and Idaho in particular. It's not an exaggeration to say that Caxton has published more books about Idaho than any other publisher. So without Caxton, we would not understand this geographical region in the way that we do. Many of the books Caxton published likely wouldn't have been published by anyone else, and so their contents would have remained unknown. Caxton's books are invaluable to the history of Idaho and the American West. James H. Gipson, the founder of Caxton Printers, has this wonderful quotation: "I don't regard books as mere merchandise. They are the basis of all culture, education, and progress." That belief guided both his life and his company. And the story of Caxton is remarkable given their publishing philosophy, their location, and the contents of their books. The company's philosophy, which lines up with that quotation, was to help writers get published regardless of whether or not Caxton earned a profit. They were particularly focused on Western writers who couldn't get published elsewhere. Their location in Caldwell, Idaho, is certainly unique. In the early 1900s, few publishing houses were located west of the Mississippi, let alone in a small town near the Rocky Mountains with a population of just a few thousand people. And on top of all that, they were concerned with producing well-made books on enduring topics. The person who established Caxton's philosophy and who was almost single-handedly responsible for the success of Caxton Printers is James Herrick Gipson. He went by J.H., or to his friends, just Jim. Gipson directed the company from its founding until its death in 1965, a span of nearly 60 years. The story of Caxton really begins in the 1890s when the Gipson family moved to Idaho. J.H. Gipson's parents, Albert E. Gipson and Lina West Gipson, brought their 8 children from Greeley, Colorado to Idaho in 1891. They lived briefly in Boise, Idaho state capital, before settling 30 miles west of Boise in Caldwell. This is a photo of the family with their 8 children taken in the early 1900s. Albert and Lina are in the center, on the top and the bottom row, and then J.H. Gipson is on the second from left in the back. The elder Gipson, Albert, acquired a printing press and founded the Gem State Rural newspaper in 1895. It was a monthly paper intended to fill a niche in southwestern Idaho. Self-described as a western farm paper, it was, as the paper described itself, devoted to horticulture, stock, farm, and irrigation matters. And it was in that small shop that J.H. Gipson first learned about printing and publishing. He worked there in his teens, as did several of his brothers. J.H. Gipson, however, wasn't the only Gipson child to have a remarkable life. In fact, the entire Gipson family really is remarkable. The family also lived remarkably long lives. All but 2 of the 10 people in that photo lived into their 80s, and 5 of them lived into their 90s. One of the sons, Lawrence Henry Gipson, was the first Rhodes Scholar from Idaho. He later won a Pulitzer Prize in History for his 15-volume series, The British Empire Before the American Revolution, and taught at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania for nearly half a century. A daughter, Alice E. Gipson, took her PhD from Yale and was dean at Lindenwood University in Missouri for 25 years. She's also author of 2 books, both published by Caxton. And then another daughter, Ruth Gipson Plowhead, was a children's author. Born in 1877, she published 7 children's books, all through Caxton. Maybe there's some nepotism going on there, or some convenient publishing arrangements. And here she is pictured with her 2 daughters. Plowhead's first book, Lucretia Ann on the Oregon Trail, garnered much attention and numerous favorable reviews. The book, in fact, is still available in print. Its popularity led Plowhead to write 2 more books featuring the Lucretia Ann character. And in addition to her writing, Ruth Gipson Plowhead was very much the most genealogically minded of her siblings, and she organized a Gipson family history book with brief biographies of her siblings and her parents. And I'll quote briefly from her own entry, which she wrote in 1929. Perhaps someone will someday be curious about me, so I will say that we live in what is called the flapper age, and even we older ones, about 50 years of age, may be as gay and youthful as we please without exciting comment. We wear dresses with short, tight-fitting skirts. I weigh in the neighborhood of 115 pounds and am 5 feet 5 inches tall. Right. What a description. How amazing that she put that all on paper for people 100 years later who were strangers to her to be able to read about. And right, if only all historical figures were that clear about describing themselves for the historical record. And beyond this published genealogy, the family also maintained a chain letter for 60 years. So one person wrote a letter, sent it on to the next sibling. Then that person wrote a letter, took the first letter, their new letter, sent it on to the third sibling, and so on until it made it all the way back around. And they did this, again, for 60 years. And the letters are really insightful. They're helpful to see not just what was going on in the family, but what also was going on nationally. So there'd be commentary about the death of this relative, or the birth of a new niece or nephew. But then also they would comment on world events like the stock market crash or the attack on Pearl Harbor. And they maintained this letter consistently from 1911 until 1971, where there are just 2 siblings left. And what's even more amazing is that they thought enough to save these letters all the way back in the early 19-teens. And it helped that Lawrence Henry Gipson was a historian and had this sort of historical, backward-looking view, but also sort of forward-thinking for preservation. And the letters are all now at Princeton University's archives. And it's impossible for you all, I'm sure, to see the salutations in these letters, but I'll read some of the ways that people would address the letters that they wrote. Dear chain members, dear members of the chain, to all the dear ones, links in the chain, dear people all. And then there's James Gipson. He didn't even finish high school, though he spent a brief year taking a few classes at the University of Idaho before returning to Caldwell, where he joined his father in the Gem State Rural print shop full-time. In 1904, Gem State Rural published its first book, a play titled Plot Against Plot by Tomé Luis de Freitas, who was a sheep herder from the Azores, who approached Gipson about printing this book and 3 other plays. I've never read it in its entirety, but I've read enough to know that it's not high literature, though there is a scene set in a Boise bar, so technically it could count as Idaho literature or Western literature. From a bibliographical standpoint, it's quite rare. There are just 3 copies that I've found in libraries, Library of Congress, Brown University in Rhode Island, and then at the Huntington. And today I had the honor of going to the Huntington for the first time and getting to handle this book and see it in person for the first time. So that was a real treat to see how it was bound and to see an extant copy of this first title. J.H. Gipson took over as managing director around the same time that Gem State Rural published Plot Against Plot. And in 1907, he changed the company's name to Caxton. And these are the articles of incorporation, which really show it was a family affair, this company. 4 of the 5 signatories on the documents are Gipson's, and the 5th was the original partner in Gem State Rural. The company is named, of course, for William Caxton, who introduced the printing press in England. And in addition to borrowing Caxton's name, Gipson also borrowed the 15th century printer's mark of Caxton. So on the left is William Caxton's printer's mark, and on the right is the Caxton Printers of Idaho logo, essentially. And here's J.H. with the bust of William Caxton, which once sat above the front door of their offices, before later being moved inside. In the 19-teens, Caxton was primarily a traditional print shop with commercial printing, binding, and lithography departments. A few years later, they branched out and into the school and office supply business and eventually became Idaho State Textbook Depository, which was a lucrative contract which they secured in the 1920s, and it's still a contract that they hold 100 years later. In their early years, they also printed books on contract. These are private printings where an author would pay them to print and bind the books. And some of their earliest books were produced for the state government. They published the Proceedings of the Idaho Constitutional Convention in 1912 and the Early History of Idaho in 1913. And both of these were paid for fully by the state of Idaho and then distributed by the government. So that Caxton simply functioned as a printer. And then even during this time, they published 2 books for an inmate at the Idaho State Penitentiary who wrote, one of the books was called Behind Gray Walls. And that was done for this inmate. This is the Caxton office during this time. J.H. Gipson is second from the right, and then his father, Albert, is on the far right. In 1925, Caxton made the transition into full-time book publishing when Caxton issued The Idaho Citizen by Fred Lukens, a book about Idaho civics. The book had initially been privately printed for the author. Gipson decided, however, to issue a second printing with Caxton purchasing the rights to the book and assuming the full financial risk for selling it, and then paying Lukens, the author, a royalty for the copies that got sold. And it turned out to be a commercial success, and it went into 7 editions, multiple printings over the next few years, and it also got adopted as a textbook by the state's Department of Education, which obviously helped to boost sales. In 1930, the first review of a Caxton book appeared. there we go. Appeared. The Salt Lake Telegram reviewed Byron Defenbach's Red Heroines of the Northwest. The reviewer not only wrote favorably of the book, but also praised Caxton Printers, saying, "You may not know it, but there's a publishing firm in Idaho that is doing more for Western literature than any of the larger houses of the East. It is the Caxton Printers of Caldwell, Idaho, which for the past several years has brought out a number of books of which the West can well be proud." And that reviewer really touched on a key aspect to the uniqueness and importance of Caxton, their location in the far West. Most publishing companies at that time were located on the East Coast, right, as they still are today. New York, Boston, Philadelphia. And so it was highlighting that there was this company out geographically located in the West. The novelist Wallace Stegner wrote a laudatory article in 1939 about Caxton. In it, Stegner wrote about the quote, colonial complex that existed in book publishing. He was referring to, again, I'll quote, the suspicion by both publishers and the public of everything not emanating from the urban centers of civilization. Of course, by urban centers, Stegner's getting at New York, Boston, and cities on the East Coast. And it really was a problem for writers of that time who lived in the West to get published. Not only if they lived in the West, but if they wrote about the West too. It was difficult for authors like that to get published and to be taken seriously by the Eastern establishment. Because of that, J.H. Gipson overarching philosophy of getting writers published, especially first-time writers who deserve to be published but may not have found success elsewhere, really resonated. Caxton knew about that East versus West tension firsthand when they published Vardis Fisher's novel In Tragic Life in 1932. Though Vardis Fisher is largely forgotten today, he was a well-known novelist with national recognition in the 1930s and 40s. He was born in eastern Idaho and lived almost his entire life in Idaho. By 1932, Fisher was already an established author. He published 2 novels with publishing houses in New York. And his latest manuscript, however, had been rejected by several publishers in the East. And according to those publishers, that book, this new book that Fisher wrote, dealt too frankly with the subject of sex. So Fisher approached Gipson to see if Caxton would publish the book. After seeking advice from external readers, Gipson agreed to take the risk on the manuscript as it was without any rewrites. "Let me make my position clear," he wrote to Fisher. "I don't feel that there is anything in your manuscript which needs changing. I think it is marvelously done. The only question is whether you and we could stay in Idaho after the books were published." Right, so what we have here is this small town, rural publisher willing to take a risk on publishing this manuscript that had been dismissed by large firms in the East. One of them I know was Houghton Mifflin, that had been rejected by these larger firms, and he didn't care what his fellow townspeople thought. Gipson didn't mind taking this risk of being shunned by Caldwell residents, so they published the book and it received positive reviews. And publishing In Tragic Life by Vardis Fisher began a 2-decade-long relationship between Gipson and Fisher, where Caxton published a dozen more of Fisher's novels. Caxton would collect reviews of their books, and in Fisher's case, they even published them in a pamphlet, and they listed the negative reviews first, unfavorable reviews. It's refreshingly honest to see these come up at first, in fact. And I'll quote from the pamphlet. "We employ no ballyhoo. We do not delete the unfavorable words and phrases," right? And they certainly weren't afraid to hide from criticism. The most notable result of Gipson and Fisher's collaborations were the books that Fisher wrote for the Federal Writers Project, or the FWP, all of which Caxton published, all 3. And the Federal Writers Project was part of the Works Progress Administration, which was part of the New Deal in the late 1930s, early 1940s. One of the main purposes of the Federal Writers Project was to have each state produce a guidebook to their state with the idea to boost tourism. Fisher was appointed the director of Idaho's Writers Project, And true to his reputation as an acerbic individualist, Fisher wrote the guidebook almost single-handedly. He traveled the state, marking down notable destinations and attractions. Gipson agreed to have Caxton publish the book. And because of their friendship, they were able to get the book ready for publication very, very quickly, far faster than the Washington, D.C. office had anticipated. But the central office bureaucrats back in D.C. wanted the Washington, D.C. guidebook to be published and sort of to be this momentous occasion. Here's the Washington, D.C. guidebook, and now look at the other 50 states. But did that happen? I'll let Fisher tell the rest of the story himself.
So they sent a man out from Washington. They called me long distance several times and said, you must not go ahead. I had this huge advantage that Judge Gipson of the Caxton Printers in Caldwell, Idaho, said we'll publish this book. And I was determined it was going to be published. And they called me several times and said, we'll send a man out to stop you. And they did send the assistant director, who was, in those years, a rather distinguished novelist. He came out to stop us from publishing that book. We got him drunk. We took him to Gipson's home. We got him drunk, and I put him on the train and sent him back to Washington. We already had and published a guide.
And so Idaho's state guidebook is the first guidebook of all of the series in the Federal Writers Project, and it really set the standard and set the stage for the rest of the states to follow. And it was so successful that these DC-based bureaucrats who were annoyed with Fisher came around to liking him, and he paid him to help the other western states finish their guidebooks, like Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, and Montana. He consulted on their projects for them. And through my research, in fact, I've managed to find several additional unpublished manuscripts that Fisher wrote for the Writers Project, but never got published for a host of reasons. He even planned to have them published by Caxton and had already had the arrangement worked out, but suffice it to say they didn't come to fruition. And one of the manuscripts was a guidebook to Boise, based on the style that he wrote the statewide guidebook in. After I discovered it in the Library of Congress, in the archives there, I transcribed it, tracked down photos, historical photos to match the text, and got it published by a Boise publishing company a few years ago. Gipson and Fisher's friendship deteriorated, however, in 1953 when Gipson asked Fisher to tone down his portrayal of Jesus Christ in one of his books before Fisher would publish it. Although Gipson wasn't religious, quote, Gipson wrote, "I've never joined or attended any church." Gipson did have, and I'm quoting, "profound respect for those who are sincerely religious." So Fisher refused Gipson's request to make the changes in the novel, writing, "You seem determined to force me to do what you feel must be done to avoid any possible offense to the Roman Church. I cannot and will not go that far. It is amazing to me when a man who says he stands for freedom of the human mind should expect me to defer to religious dogmas when my books, as you well know, rest upon the findings of the greatest scholars." So that really ended their friendship, their relationship. Fisher never again had a novel published by Caxton. He instead, for those interested, went with Swallow Press in Denver for the rest of his novels. Prospects were looking particularly strong for Caxton when tragedy struck on St. Patrick's Day, 1937. A fire swept through the plant, destroying almost all the structures. The fire caused more than $500,000 worth of damage. However, they did not let this tragedy set them back for very long. Gipson vowed to rebuild almost immediately, and they did so. They got the plant back up and running within a few months. Despite being in the Great Depression, Gipson even managed to pay his employees while they were closed for rebuilding. Now, selfishly, from an archival researcher standpoint, this also means that the company's early records are almost entirely destroyed. Almost anything before 1937 didn't survive, and the records that did survive from before the fire look like this and are extremely charred. And amazingly, the archivists where these papers are housed still let me handle these materials, but they would sort of chip and flake off in my hands. And luckily, for those that did survive, it's mostly around the edges, so I can often read the actual contents. In the 1940s and 50s, Caxton continued publishing books and did so with growing national attention. Reviewers also noted the high quality of Caxton's books. According to one article, Caxton expels on each book the same loving care and painstaking craftsmanship characterizing the handicraft of that earlier Caxton. Every title was printed on site, it was hand-bound, and they often printed deluxe editions and that were usually signed by the author. Articles appeared in large newspapers, including New York Times and the LA Times, and Gipson maintained a growing list of correspondents, including Ezra Pound and H.L. Mencken. And Jack Conroy, the leftist labor writer best known for the book The Disinherited, praised Caxton for their approach in publishing. He wrote, "Writers too frank or too limited in popular appeal to tempt commercial publishers have been given a voice. Caxton doesn't dump their slow sellers on the remainders tables, where they sell with no royalty to the author a few months after publication, which was and is a common practice for larger publishers." So this philosophy meant that Caxton, of course, contributed more than a few titles to the ever-growing list of books of bad poetry. However, for every dud that Caxton published, there was multifold more that made lasting contributions. And I want to highlight a few titles that are related to California that are particularly notable. Yokohama, California, by Toshio Mori, for example, is the first work of fiction, by a Japanese American of fiction ever published, and Caxton published it in 1949. Mori was born and raised in Oakland. He worked in his family's garden nursery during the day and wrote short stories in his spare time at night. William Saroyan, another California writer, was the one who really encouraged Mori to try to find a publisher and a wider audience for his work. Gipson liked Mori's stories and proceeded with plans for Caxton to publish a collection of them. On December 2nd, 1941, Caxton Printers and Mori signed a contract and set a publication date for the following autumn. But as some of you have quickly picked up, right just 5 days later, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and the world changed. And so Mori and his family were sent to the internment camp at Topaz in Utah, and Caxton decided to hold off on publishing the book. After the conclusion of the war, however, Caxton went ahead and published the book, and it received good reviews but poor sales. And yet, nonetheless, this publication cemented Mori's status as being the first Japanese American to have a work of fiction published. And Mori's whole life and his struggle to get published and to get recognition really is quite a story. Another book illustrates Gipson's commitment to his authors and to freedom of the press. Angels on the Bough was the first novel of a young college professor at Washington State. Caxton published Samuel Stewart's novel in 1936. According to some of the administration at Washington State, however, this novel was racy because it included a sympathetic portrayal of a prostitute. And that issue, coupled with Stewart's rumored support of a student strike on campus, led to Stewart's dismissal, or rather the non-renewal of his contract, depending on whose side you take. Gipson was so upset by Stewart's dismissal and that he publicly supported him and wrote editorials and wrote letters to everyone that he could. However, despite Gipson's protestations, Stewart was nevertheless not rehired. After moving back to the Midwest, Stewart had a bit of a career change and began publishing gay erotica under a pseudonym and took up tattooing. Stewart left academia full-time to ply his trade as a tattoo artist full-time on Chicago's South Side. And then in the 1960s, he moved to California and opened up a tattoo parlor in Oakland, where he became the official tattoo artist for the Hells Angels.
Oh my God.
So, and Stewart's story and his whole literary career really is a whole lecture in and of itself. And long before the so-called Tiger King became famous on Netflix, there was the Tiger Queen, Mabel Stark, the world's first female tiger trainer. Caxton published her autobiography in 1938 and was successful enough it went into multiple printings. And after leaving the circus, Stark continued working with tigers at Jungle Land, which I gather is a now defunct private zoo in Thousand Oaks, down the road from here. And this book, Hold That Tiger, is actually just one in a series of books about circus and the circus and circus-related figures that Caxton published. They also brought out books about Louis Roth, who was a tiger trainer himself, and Al Barnes, and the Ringling Brothers. And two other notable Caxton books that feature Los Angeles include Manuel Boaken's I Have Lived with the American People. Boaken wrote the story of his experiences as a Filipino immigrant in California, and that was published in 1948. He lived in Los Angeles for several years before moving to Stockton and then to Watsonville, where there's a large Filipino population, or at least there was at the time. And Timothy Turner, who was a local Los Angeles journalist, wrote Turn Off the Sunshine in the early 1940s. It's a compilation of stories about, as it's billed, tales on Los Angeles on the wrong side of the tracks. And that's a compilation of stories that he previously published elsewhere. Caxton also sort of published fun, unexpected books that are long forgotten today. For example, The Stag at Ease, published in 1938, is a collection featuring the culinary preferences of a number of distinguished male citizens of the world, as it was billed. These distinguished contributors included, among others, President Franklin Roosevelt, H.L. Mencken, Ed Sullivan, John Dos Passos, Edgar Lee Masters, and then Robert Frost, who, as you might be able to see there, likes his fire-roasted potatoes to have burnt skins. And I want to note that Gipson was not just a book publisher, he was very much involved with politics. In 1912, he served as the state chairman of the Bull Moose Party, which worked to re-elect Theodore Roosevelt. And he was also a member of the Progressive Party of Idaho, and then later he became involved with Republican Party politics. He was good friends with Idaho Senator William Borah and corresponded with politicians across the country. Gipson was anti-war and promoted free market economics. Given J.H. Gibson's libertarian leanings and political activity, he published a large number of books in their Libertarian Library series, including Ayn Rand's Anthem in 1952, which was the first hardcover American edition of that title. And they also published Rose Wilder Lane and Isabel Patterson, who with Rand sort of formed the three female founders of modern libertarianism. And turning back to Caxton's history, J.H. Gibson passed away in 1965 at the age of 79. And in spite of the loss, Caxton continued strong. Gibson's two sons, J.H. Jr. and Gordon, who had long worked at Caxton for their father, took over the business as president and managing director. In the 1960s and 70s, it was a time of sustained success. The publishing division continued bringing out books about Idaho and the West, and Caxton Books won several awards for both excellence in publishing and for excellence in writing. In 1998, they changed the name of their publishing arm to Caxton Press and retained the name Caxton Printers for their overall company, for their contract and printing jobs specifically, and which still to this day remains the bulk of their work. They print ballots, for example, for 33 Idaho counties. And they're still Idaho's official state textbook depository. And they also serve as the distributor for several small presses. And 5 years ago, the U.S. Senate Committee on Small Business named Caxton the Small Business of the Month for the entire country. And they still publish books. They've narrowed their scope to be almost solely focused on history and travel guides related to the West and to the Western states. So no more books of poetry. Some recent titles include Ranching Women of Colorado, Tombstone, Arizona Mystique, Backcountry Roads, Idaho, Bicycling the Oregon Trail, and the California Trail, to name just a few. Caxton today is still owned and managed by the Gipson family. Scott Gipson, J.H. Gibson's great-grandson, is the president and publisher of the company. His brother Ron is the chief operating officer, and their father Dave Gipson is the past president and current chairman of the board. And they still hold to J.H. Gibson's original philosophy to publish good books about the region regardless of how many they sell. In fact, as Scott Gipson has told me, he views printing as part of the sacred trust the company still holds. The company's bylaws, in fact, dictate that they continue to publish books even though they continue not to make much money selling them. They're really subsidized by their other publishing division, the other divisions of the company. And despite all that has changed in the publishing world over the last 100 years, and all the major changes in which the way that information is disseminated and gathered, Caxton Printers continues on in much the same way that it operated in its early decades, when it was under the care of James H. Gipson. They're still in Caldwell, Idaho, still at 312 West Main Street. They're still publishing authors that other houses won't, and they're still not concerned about making a profit with their books. And their focus is still on quality and wanting to produce a long-lasting book. All of this, their philosophy, their location, their quality, their whole history, really forms an integral part in preserving the history of Idaho and the American West. And they also remain true to their founding philosophy that books are more than mere merchandise. Thanks very much. I'm happy to take questions, and well, before we do that, I want to point out that this is a bookmark that Caxton issued with copies of all their books in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And they're so focused on books as sort of a physical object that they warn people not to display the book open, and then also teach people how, in fact, to open a book properly.
I love that. I want to get one of those. Yeah. So we have time for some questions. Do we have any questions? Ken?
Can you say something about your own collection that you formed of the Caxton imprints? And is there some book that you've never been able to find?
Yes, any of the Plot Against Plot, that very first book that was issued in 1907. If anyone has a copy of that, please get in touch. Yes, so when I started researching Caxton, which was about 5 or 6 years ago, I would see in bookshops in Boise, they'd often perhaps have a section for Caxton, and that was really intriguing to me. And that was what led me to start researching about Caxton. It's sort of how I discovered it. And so, as I began researching it, I started picking up titles here and there. And in fact, my wife got me my first Caxton title, and it was a modern book of theirs, Backcountry Roads, Idaho, which is a fun one to have. But in used bookshops, I would find them, and then of course I would turn to the internet and get them from all over, and try to build up not just their Western series, but also literature, the Artist Fisher titles, and then some of their libertarian books, which are fairly hard to find, I found. And so now I have a small collection, modest collection of a couple hundred of their titles, and they've published about 1,000 total.
You said a couple hundred?
Yes, so maybe that's not, small is perhaps relative, and it probably takes more than a small amount of space in our house. But I've been pleased to develop relationships with some used bookstores, especially one in Caldwell, where the descendant of one of the first Caxton employees had their relatives' Caxton books, brought him into the bookstore, and then the proprietor of the bookstore reached out to me, and I was able to go over there and find some hard-to-find titles, which has been a great fun. So it's always a search and always a delight to see a Caxton title on a spine of a book in a bookstore.
Elizabeth?
Yes, I heard a reference to that you do something with K-12 students, taking them to say a little bit about what you do to inspire them to be interested in
sure.
books and so on.
Sure, in my day job, I'm an archivist and librarian at Boise State, and I'm responsible, I'm the liaison to K through 12 schools in the area that want to come to Boise State and to give their students an experience in an academic library. And so specifically, I work with some middle school teachers who bring their middle school students, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, into Boise State's library for National History Day. And so this is a national program, and so they'll do some other research for their National History Day project and get some experience using academic library databases, academic sources, and get exposure to this wider world of research outside of their school's library.
Do you talk to them about Caxton Press?
I don't. I want to keep them awake. I maybe individually with a few of them, but I mostly just talk about my skills as a researcher and how they can develop them too.
Sounds wonderful.
Thank you.
Other questions? Steve?
Great presentation, Alessandro. And on a couple of occasions, you mentioned the racy content
Yes.
of Caxton press books. Would it even merit a censorship attempt or anything like that in this day and age? Would we consider it really, really mild?
Yes. Yeah. In a word, yes. I read Angel on the Bow, and it was all subtext. Anything about that sort of prostitute, Lady of the Night character, and so no. Yeah. In short, it would not warrant any type of second thought today. 8
But
years
back
later.
then, were there any protests by the public?
Nothing, for the Vardis Fisher book, nothing at all, and for the Samuel Stewart, just his resulting firing. And I think there was a lot going on there on campus. It was the president of that Washington State College, I think, sort of just had it out for this lecture and was able to use publishing this book and his support of a student strike to get rid of him and get him out of there.
Yes. Oh, 2 questions.
How many books, once Fisher left and went to Denver, how many other books did he publish?
It's a good question. About 15 more. Perhaps his most famous book that you in the room might know is Mountain Man, which was turned into the movie Jeremiah Johnson, starring Robert Redford and directed by Sidney Pollack. That came out with Morrow in the early 1960s. So roughly 12 to 15 books were published by Alan Swallow in Denver, and then a couple other publishers.
Daria?
So I saw in some of your pictures that there were at least images of Native Americans in Idaho, and I'm sort of curious if the current Caxton Press is connecting to any indigenous historians for some of the book publishing. Are they connecting into that history?
Yeah, they still are, and in fact, they have been, even going back in the 1930s and 40s. Caxton published a couple of books by Lucullus Virgil McWhorter, who was one of the first, or not one of the, he was the first white person that the Nez Perce tribe sort of talked to and sort of brought in. And so this McWhorter person wrote 2 books about the Nez Perce tribe and sort of featured the tribe's perspective. And so these books, one is called Yellow Wolf and the other one is called Hear Me, My Chiefs, still serve as sort of foundational scholarship on the Nez Perce tribe. And then Caxton also published in the 1930s, late 1930s, a book called Coyote Stories by a woman named Mourning Dove, who was an indigenous woman of the tribe in eastern Washington, northern Idaho. And Mourning Dove was actually the first female Native American novelist. Caxton didn't publish that book, another one did, but these stories gathered sort of from the tribal elders Caxton brought out, and McWhorter had a role in that too. And then so that started 80 years ago, and then still to this day, Caxton in the 90s and 2000s and still now publishes sort of scholarly manuscripts on mostly northwestern tribes. Thanks for that question.
We'll take one more question if somebody has one.
Just gonna make a comment.
Go ahead.
I did an internet search of Yokohama, California, Maury's book, and the 1949 original, there's some bookseller in Portland that has it for $3,000.
No.
Inscribed in 49. But then the next highest one is $1,000, and it's a perfect review copy in dust jacket for $1,000, but not inscribed.
Yes, yes. And it's fun to see. I published some articles about Tosho Mori, and it's fun, after that article came out a few years ago, to see booksellers have really lengthy descriptions of Yokohama, California with language that's mine. So, booksellers in the trade gather their descriptions from everywhere, but it's like, I've never had half, but I thought to email them, I wrote part of your description. Could we work out a discount to fund this book?
Great.
Thank you.
Did anybody else want to say any comments before we wrap up?
What was the total printing of the book? 1,000,
Oh.
2,000, 5,000?
Small. Offhand, I want to say it was 250, or maybe that's my memory saying that's how many sold, and it was a print run of maybe 500, something like that. It was a fairly small print run, as tended to be the case for a lot of these Caxton books. Sort of a small run and then small sales.
Go ahead.
Quick question, do they print their own books still, or do they send them out for printing elsewhere?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Almost all the books, they still print on site, and they print and bind them there. I think occasionally some titles, especially if it's a larger book with a larger print run, they will send out, but they still have a lot of presses running, and just made an announcement about a very new, very fancy printer.
So like a big color illustrated book they might send out.
Exactly, yeah, you've got it. You've
Like
got it.
everybody else.
Great, well, let's wrap up. Let's join
Thanks
me in
very much.
thanking our speakers. No, you kept it on. So everybody, on behalf of the Book Club of California, I want to thank Ken Carniol, our funder for this lecture series, again, our speaker, Alessandro Meregaglia, and you for attending this Book Club of California presentation. Thanks everyone for coming out tonight. I invite you to join us for another program here in person in Southern California or on Zoom in the new year. So you can register for any of our programs or events online at bccbooks.org/programs. You could click the link in any of the emails that you're probably getting from the Book Club of California about our programs, or you can email me on kevin@bccbooks.org and I'll sign you up for any program you're interested in. Thanks everyone for coming, and we'll hope to see you soon. Good night.